But that means we need to go back to 1 Timothy this morning, which is just fine. I'm enjoying this passage as well. 1 Timothy chapter 3, we're continuing the discussion of the role of elders in the church and their qualifications as Paul understands them and what he's trying to accomplish. And remember that this chapter sits within the larger picture of Paul speaking to the church. This isn't just being written to elders. This is being written to the church. And this is being written to a church to say to them, listen, you need to understand what it means to be a church. A church is defined by her doctrinal boundaries. It's defined by what she believes and holds fast to. And a church that holds fast to the orthodox teaching that's been transmitted by the Spirit of God through the apostles and His Word is what defines the boundaries of a church. And the church is to be careful that it is led by men who understand this idea, that they understand that this is a noble task that they're being called to, a noble task. They are, Paul has already told us, they are to be above reproach. They are to be men who demonstrate in their reputations and in their actions that they are above reproach, particularly, as you will note, when it comes to the most visible relationship that they have, and that, of course, would be the relationship that they have with their spouse, their wives. They are to be sober-minded. They are to be safe of mind, as I pointed out last week. They're to be the kind of men that we trust when it comes to leading us doctrinally. They understand what orthodoxy is, and they hold fast to it and lead their people. They need to be hospitable, not in the sense that they're good at throwing dinner parties, but they're good at meeting the real needs of the people of the church. They know what the people truly and really need, and they focus their attention there, particularly as they use their gift of teaching, particularly as they focus on the whole office of transmitting information, the doctrines of the faith to the people. And that fits perfectly, does it not, with chapter 1, in which Paul was concerned that the church at Ephesus was struggling with a great deal of heterodoxy which had creeped into the church, and so Paul's giving a remedy to that here. Appoint men who believe that the church is in fact held fast by its doctrinal boundaries. Put them in positions of leadership. So Paul has given to us in verses 2 and 3 then a number of qualifications or job descriptions or whatever that he puts before them. But then starting in verse 3, he gives us a couple of nots. Okay, notice how he switches from positives to negatives in verse 3. So he says that elders are not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. All right, so let's just focus on a few of those for a few moments. Paul says that the elder is not to be a drunkard. The King James says not given to much wine. Okay, I like the translation a little better. Not given to much wine. Now, it is unlikely here that Paul is thinking of the fact that elders will have the need to drink to escape their frustrations. It's highly unlikely that's where Paul is going here. More likely, Paul includes this because it speaks to the priorities of the elder. I mean, it's highly unlikely that Paul would even entertain the idea of, well, you know, if you got a guy in the congregation who has all the right other qualifications but is a drunkard, bring him on. Doesn't seem likely even that he would have to include this in the list, right? So there must be something bigger behind the word. It must be something more that Paul must be going at. Now let me just be clear of something here. Paul is not commanding here abstinence from alcohol. In fact, there is no such prohibition in the Bible. Contrary to some of our fundamentalist Baptist friends, there is no command in Scripture that we are never to consume alcohol. There are prohibitions against drunkenness, certainly, and the improper use of anything, whether it be alcohol or the internet or your car, is prohibited, but there's no prohibition against the consumption of alcohol. That's not where Paul is going here. In fact, the key word you'll notice in the King James is given to, which means having an addiction to, being under the power of. That would clearly be prohibited. But Paul is not prohibiting the consumption, the moderate use of alcohol. I think what Paul is going after here is a simple idea. Someone addicted to wine, or I dare say anything, someone addicted to anything, is someone more concerned about himself than others. I mean, think about an addict of any kind, no matter what they're addicted to, whether it be drugs or alcohol or power or money or position or anything, whatever it might be that they're addicted to, that they have to have in order to live, they become a person more focused on themselves than anything else. That's fundamental in addiction. So Paul is not going after the idea, don't choose men that are drunks. He's talking here about choose men whose priorities are more important in terms of those outside of himself than himself. It goes to the priorities of the man. Is he wrapped up in personal pleasure, or does he see the role as one of self-sacrifice? Is the role, as he sees it, one of standing and saying, listen, I'm going to put aside what I will consider pleasurable in order to meet the needs of others, even if that means sacrifice of my own desires and pleasures in order to take care of others. So in other words, what Paul is saying, I think, is that an elder must be a man who is more concerned about the spiritual lives of his people than he is about his own personal happiness or pleasures. And we need to be careful with that, because the fact of the matter is that as human beings, we have a tendency to equate pleasure, particularly in our culture, with fulfillment. Today, pleasure is fulfillment, as though missing a pleasure is a lack of fulfillment. That is the message, by the way, of every commercial that you see on TV. The message is, this thing will give you fulfillment. This is the thing that will finally satisfy the desire of your heart. It's a lie. It's a lie spun from the depths of hell. In fact, it's the very lie that Satan told Eve in the garden. This is finally what will give you fulfillment. Our fulfillment is not found in the things of this world. Our fulfillment is found in the person of Jesus Christ. He is our fulfillment. But he's not going to necessarily lead us to pleasure. We will find our lives filled with struggle at times. And Paul is arguing here, I think, by implication, that an elder's life is going to be one in which he is going to say, I'm going to put aside pleasure, I'm going to put aside the things of this world in order to carry out the most important thing that can be, which is to lead his people further towards this Christ. And I would argue, being a practicing elder, that there's real fulfillment in that. It's when you see people who have listened to your preaching, and then they, over time, slowly begin to change the priorities of their lives, and you see it subtly. There's great fulfillment in that. It's not very pleasurable necessarily, but it's fulfilling. But then Paul goes on and he adds some more to this thought. Not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle. Again, in the King James it says not a brawler. Okay, not a brawler, not someone who's ready and quick to pick a fight. All right? Now, why, again, would Paul include this trait in the list of negative characteristics? I mean, again, it's almost as though someone comes along and says, well, Paul is warning against choosing drunk men, but he's also warning about choosing guys that like pick fights. Is it possible that Paul is looking here and saying there could be, quote unquote, violent men who wish to serve as elders? Now, what do I mean by violent? Okay, I'm not talking about guys that as you're walking down the hallway, they punch you in the face. That's not what I'm talking about, okay? That's not the kind of violence I'm referring to. I'm talking about the fact that the job itself, the role of being an elder, can be frustrating at times. And there is a natural tendency among men to be somewhat short-tempered. So what we're talking about here is not someone who is violent, but someone, in that sense of punching in the face, but someone who struggles to control their emotions. Someone who struggles to control themselves in the sense of being able to have a consistency of emotion regardless of what they face from day to day. In other words, being able to handle frustration without becoming violent. Notice I put it in quotation marks. Violent in the sense of becoming angry or frustrated and taking it out, if you will, on others. Now, again, given the context of this book, as Paul has already said in chapter 1, right, that it's likely that Paul is talking here about the fact that some will become easily frustrated by the fact that there are people in the church that are teaching what is false. And they can't control them. And they get frustrated and angry. And they respond in ways that are inconsistent with what they're supposed to be doing as elders. Let me explain this. Let me explain this by giving to you the minister's aphorism. Okay? And everybody who's ever been a minister will agree with this statement absolutely. I'm expecting Brian to jump up out of his seat here and go, "Amen, brother." The church would be great if it wasn't for the people. Amen? Yeah, right? I mean, that's how it is. The church would be great if it wasn't for the people. Now, obviously, that's a foolish statement because the church is the people. But that's the point, isn't it? The fact of the matter is that it is frustrating at times to work with people. Any of you who work with people know how this is, right? You understand the idea that people can be frustrating. In a church, you think about people, they don't always do what they're expected to do, right? There's expectations and people don't meet your expectations. That's frustrating. It's frustrating when they take a long time to learn even the most simple biblical concepts. You hammer the same point over and over and over again, and it seems like they never get it. They don't understand. That's frustrating. The elder has to fight against many other things that vie for the attention of the sheep. And we live in a day in which this is absolutely right. I get 1 hour of your time out of the 168 that you have in a week. I get 1 hour of it. And sometimes some of you think that's too much, as it is. But 1 hour of time, and so for the other 167, you are being bombarded by every imaginable thinking process and worldview. You are being bombarded from every direction about every imaginable way of thinking. So I've got 1 hour a week to try to change what the other 167 are all about. That's frustrating. And sometimes I think one of the most frustrating things, and this is the one that, again, I think every elder will jump up and down and say absolutely, the average person in the pew has no idea what it actually means to be an elder. Oh, they think they do. They've got advice, but they're not really, they've never been an elder, they've never been called to be an elder, but yet they have advice on how to be one. These are all matters of frustration. In fact, I am convinced that the reason why almost half of ministers quit before 5 years of service is simply because of frustration. In the church today, guys that are coming out of seminary today and graduating out of seminary, half of them will quit the ministry entirely before 5 years are up. They'll quit because it's frustrating to work with people. They set their expectations to people and their churches, and it never gets met. And the natural assumption must be then, according to them, well, I'm not cut out to do this, so they'll go do something else. I think this is the reason why Spurgeon said to his students in his lectures to his students' book, if you could do anything else, no matter what it is, do it, other than preaching. If you have to spend your whole life digging ditches rather than preaching, do that rather than preach, because it's frustrating. I remember vividly the very first church that I went to, that I was called to in Mississippi, 2001. And I had not been a pastor before, so I was idealistic. I wouldn't say I was young. I was 41 years old at the time. But I was idealistic. Boy, I thought to myself, this is going to be great. I'm going to go into this church and I'm going to preach to these people and they're going to hear the word of God and they're going to stand up and they're going to make changes. Things are going to be great, and I'm going to clean up this membership roll that hasn't been touched in forever, and we're going to get the deacons on board with this and that, and we're going to do all these kinds of things. And 2 years later, we packed up a U-Haul and left. And I look back upon it now and I think it was a tremendous training exercise, because this is what it was. It was a training exercise in recognizing that if you set your expectations too high, you will be disappointed. So I've learned not to set my expectations so high. Do I still expect things? Oh yeah. But now I step back and go, yep, okay, that's normal. They didn't meet it. That's okay, that's normal. Frustration turns into violence in the sense of it becomes something within us that drives us away. So here's what Paul is saying, I think, here. An elder must be a man who is consistent in his emotional state and patient, able to recognize the limitations of working with people and gently guide his flock over time to maturity in the Lord. One of the lessons that I learned it the hard way, is that in order to be effective in the lives of people as a preacher, you need time to build some street cred. You have to build some street cred. You've got to take some time to get people to trust you. It takes years to do that. And even here at Grace Fellowship, I'm not there yet. There are some of you that don't trust me. But that's okay. It's all right. I'm working on it. Little by little, day by day. Patience. Patience is what Paul is talking about. So, Paul is saying, you can't put men into this whose priorities are on themselves, number one. And then secondly, you can't put men into this who are not emotionally stable. They've got to be men who have demonstrated over time that they know how to deal with the frustrations of humans who are inconsistent and unpredictable. But then thirdly, he says they must not be quarrelsome. That goes, I think, with this idea. They must be careful not to vent their frustrations in ways that are unproductive, is the quarrelsome aspect here. So they mustn't be violent, they mustn't be a brawl, they must not be quarrelsome. But the final one of verse 3 is they must not be a lover of money. Or the much better translation to me, and one of my favorite statements, is the King James, not greedy for filthy lucre. Now again, this is not Paul suggesting that an elder should not be compensated. All right? What he's suggesting here is not that the elder should not be compensated. In fact, if you read 1 Corinthians 9 very carefully, particularly verse 14, Paul speaks there and makes a very strong case for the idea that a church should compensate a teaching elder so that he does not have to worry about feeding his family, but can focus all of his attention on the spiritual needs of the congregation. That those men out of the elders that are set aside for the purpose of preaching and teaching, they should be compensated by the church so that they can focus their full attention on that work. So they don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from, that it's taken care of. And that, by the way, you flip that over, that's exactly what you as a church should be doing. This is why a congregation should say, we want to pay the man because we don't want him worrying about anything else except us. In other words, there's a selfish motivation in compensating an elder. And the selfish motivation is, listen, pastor, don't worry about working at Walmart in order to pay the bills. Get in that office back there and study this word and come out here and preach, and we will take care of your family's responsibilities and needs. Okay, so there's a selfish motivation in it. It's selfish in the sense of a good selfishness of we want the word preached to us, so don't be thinking about anything else, just be thinking about that. Paul's not speaking of that. Paul's speaking here of the idea of being a lover of money or greedy for money. The key word there is a lover of money. He must not be a lover of money. In other words, the elder should not be the man whose view of monetary compensation is one of the following two things. Number one, the elder should not consider some compensation to be something he takes under false pretenses. And what do I mean by that? You see, the one side of the coin would be for you as a congregation to say, we're going to pay you, pastor, so that you can do your job without distraction. But you, elder, must not look at this as something like it's just a career. That's false pretenses. If I think of the ministry as just a career where you pay me and I cash the check and enjoy my life out there, you know, the old aphorism, you only work one day a week, you're the most overpaid man in the world. I mean, look how much you're making per hour. If you think about it as an elder from the perspective of a career, you're taking it under false pretenses. You're not actually taking the money from the congregation so that you're focusing your attention on their spiritual needs by focusing 40 hours a week in the job. That's a false pretense. That's a false pretense. There are a lot of men to that who do that. There's a lot of men who come out of seminary who absolutely are convinced, man, this is going to be the best possible job. I mean, I can come and go as I want. I only work one day a week. It's going to be great. But that's false pretenses. So the lover of money is the one who takes the money under those pretenses. But the second side of that is those who extort from the congregation over against what the true job description of the elder is. Now, what am I talking about there? Notice I use the word extortion. In other words, the man who is paid and who thinks then that because he's paid, he should only preach what the people want to hear. Now, only a page over in your Bible, probably even on the page in front of you, you see 1 Timothy 4. In the latter days, some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. They will want to hear that which will, as he says in the next letter, tickle their ears. So you see, it's a two-sided coin in the sense of this compensation issue and money. On the one hand, it's the elder who says, well, I'm going to take this money and then I'm just going to think of it as a career. But to flip it over, it's also the elder who says, well, because you're paying me, I'm going to live under the constant fear that you're not going to pay me anymore. And so I'm going to back off preaching anything to you that might get you to stop writing the check. In other words, I'm going to extort from you your money by not preaching what you want to hear. That's a form of extortion. Now notice the balance problem there, right? The balance problem there is there should be expectations on both sides of that coin. The expectation of yours should be, Pastor, we're paying you, do your job. The elder's response should be, then I'm going to do my job irrespective of whether you pay me. That's difficult. That's hard. And those of us who have, as Paul says, made our living from preaching the gospel, it's a difficult balance to bear. But that's where Paul says, don't pursue men who look at money as something that they love. Notice the pleasure aspect of it again. They're not in it for the money. And by the way, Paul will return to this issue of pastor compensation in chapter 5 of this book. He must have considered it important because he repeats himself in verses 17 and 18 of chapter 5. In other words, what Paul really is trying to say is that those elders who are paid must be men who focus on the spiritual maturity of the believers, accepting compensation as a secondary consideration only. A secondary consideration. The primary consideration being, I'm going to preach the word, I'm going to stand before you and tell you what you need to hear, even if that means you say, well, I'm not paying him anymore. The word must be preached. So notice the balance in that. Paul says don't put men in that position who are just in it for the money. You will disappoint yourself if you do. So in verse 3, he throws out a few nots. Not a drunkard, not a quarreler, not violent, not a lover of money. But then in verse 4, he turns back to a more positive sense. And he says in verse 4, he must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. So if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? Now, as I read this and compare it to Titus, which is the other list, right, the parallel list in Titus, I think it is likely here that Paul is referring specifically to the relationship of the elder to his children. Okay? If you read this text, particularly as it appears in the parallel text, the household here is not Paul dealing with elders and their wives. Why? Because he's already talked about that previously in this same paragraph. So when he talks about household here, he's referring to the relationship of the elder to his children. Notice he mentions them specifically, keeping his children submissive. Okay, so he gives a specific parallel in this idea. The only reference to a household then in Titus 1 is children. If you go read the parallel passage in Titus, the only reference is to children there. And again, he's already referenced the relationship of the elder to his wife in verse 2. So he's speaking here to the elder who has children and how the elder deals with them, how he manages his household. Now, this term manage is obvious. It means to guide. It means to be active in helping. Literally, it means to stand before. To be the manager of a household means to stand before them and represent before the world who they are in the world. To proactively guide the family, particularly the children, in all matters. That's what dads are called to do. Now notice, this wouldn't apply just to elders, by the way. Okay? Obviously. All of us as men who have children, wives and children, our responsibility is to manage our household, to manage our children, to be in front of them, to be directing them, to be leading them, to be raising them. Here, however, I think what Paul is doing is he's referring to the idea of elders serving as examples to other fathers about raising their kids. So this is a man who is specifically set aside to the office of elder, and part of the qualifications upon which the other elder should look is, does this man have an ability to manage? And what's the one thing he's going to have to manage? Well, his own home, his own family life. Now, Paul says that in this case, the children must be submissive. So what he's going to do here, here's what Paul's going to do. He's going to say, let me describe what a properly managed home looks like, particularly the home of an elder. The children must be submissive. Now, we know what that word means, right? I don't have to get out a dictionary for you. It means obedient. It means following after. In a sense, the word means imitating by example. The father's example is such that the children imitate him in the world. Now, question. Does Paul insist here, and in the parallel passage in Titus 1, that the children of an elder must be believers in order for him to be an elder? Is a man disqualified if his kids have not come to faith in Christ? And I think the answer to that question must be no, okay, for a number of reasons. Number one, given that the context here is about the reputation of the elder, specifically his character which leads to his abilities, Paul does not mention here the fact that the ability of an elder is determined by how successful he was at converting his kids. Ability doesn't go to that end, does it? Therefore, it is highly likely that Paul is not insisting that the children of elders must be believers, but rather that they are fully under the control of the elder in his own house. If they are living in his house and they are not believers, they're still under his control. They may not be believers, but they are still submitted to his authority in his house. Another reality, of course, is that if, in fact, Paul was insisting that every child of an elder must be a believer, then he automatically disqualifies younger men. Because there might be men whose children are too young to actually be believers in the fully expressed sense of the word. Yes, they might be going to Sunday school and have all the catechism answers, but they may not necessarily yet show the fruits of conversion which come as life goes deeper. So clearly Paul's not going there. And, of course, if we're going to be theologically sound and consistent, we must remember that there's no guarantee that a man or his wife who are believers will necessarily have children who are believers. The elect are not determined by household status, right? One of the biggest distinctions that we make with our Presbyterian brothers and sisters is that we do not believe that belief is transferable, that faith is transferable. Election is God's purpose to every person individually, not by household. That's why we as a church do not embrace household membership. We don't bring the whole family up here and say, okay, mom, dad, and all the kids and the babies are now members of the church because, well, mom and dad are believers, so that must imply that the rest are. As Baptists, we eschew that. We recognize that God's elective activity works in the lives of each individual. We would pray, of course, that as parents are leading their children in the things of the Lord, that these children will indeed respond, that God has, in fact, brought them through the ordinary means of grace to faith. But there's no guarantees that that's going to be the case. I have a good friend whose children, he's a pastor. He's been an elder for years. And he has one of his sons who's just recently come to faith, and he's almost 40 years old. And he prayed for many decades for this young man to come to faith, but wondered whether or not he was, in fact, included in the Lord's elect. The good news is that he has now come to faith, but it didn't disqualify him from being an elder because his children were not believers. There's no guarantee that just because you are a believer that your children will be or your grandchildren will be. Oh yes, we will pray for them and we will preach to them and hope that the Lord will indeed move. But we must be careful that we do not fall into the trap of thinking that just because we're believers that our children and grandchildren automatically are. Be careful with that. So what Paul is doing here is he's connecting the management ability of a man in his home to his ability to manage a church. Notice verse 5. It's a very important verse. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, this is a rhetorical question, right? How will he care for God's church? If he doesn't have the ability to manage his own children and the frustrations of the little rebels that he has at home, how is he going to manage the older rebels that he has in the church? How's he going to be a good manager of an organization like a church if he cannot manage his own home? If he cannot manage his own family life? Let's not forget that what Paul is going after here is the reputation of this institution called the church. Right? Is that not the point of the whole book? There's a reputation at stake here. The gospel of Jesus Christ is at stake here. Because the world out there is going to look at this organization and they're going to ask fundamental questions about what we believe and teach based upon how we act as a group. And if they look at the church and see it as nothing more than an entertainment venue, then they have every right, for example, to say, well, why should I join that organization for my entertainment? I can get my entertainment from over here. And I can get it for a lot cheaper than what it requires out of me at the church. There's a reputation at stake. If the church is filled with discord and disharmony and people who are angry with each other, and it shows, and those people that are on this side of the church never talk to the people that are on this side of the church, the world is going to know it. They're going to understand it. And they're going to say, I don't have to listen to you tell me how I'm supposed to live based on how you live. And they have every right to do that. That's what Paul is putting in front of the church and saying, listen, you have to understand. The very reputation of your message is undergirded by the message of your behavior in the church and how you react to one another. If you have elders who are not able to control the lives of their congregation and what's going on in this body as a group of people, then your message loses its thump. It loses its thump. An elder, therefore, Paul says, must be a man whose household, his children, proves his ability to manage a family life well, especially the family life of the church. But then in verses 6 and 7, Paul gives some final things. In this case, he gives two things in which he, if you look closely, he says, be careful not to fall into a trap. There are two traps that are laid here in these verses. There are two landmines, if you will, that we must avoid. The first one is in verse 6, the second is in verse 7. Verse 6, he must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. The whole phrase, become puffed up with conceit, is one word in the Greek. Typhou, just one word. It means to become inflated with self-pride, to be high-minded, to assume that you are greater than others. Okay? But here's what's interesting. The literal definition of this word typhou is to be enveloped with smoke. It literally means to be enveloped with smoke. I would add, and mirrors. The reality is that in many evangelical churches, Baptist churches in particular, it is not uncommon for the congregation to place the pastor on a pedestal. Right? It's not uncommon for people to place a pastor on a pedestal, to treat him as though he's someone more special than the rest of us. I mean, after all, he's the pastor. We say that with all deference to him, right? To treat him as someone extraordinarily important just by virtue of his position. It is human nature, unfortunately, to do that. It is. It's common. It happens. But the problem is that this becomes then for the man something by which he then operates. How many churches, for example, do you see where a singular pastor who's been placed on a pedestal by their congregation becomes a dictator in the life of the church? It's my way or the highway, pal. You don't like what's going on here? Go away. And how many pastors find themselves being elevated by their congregations into positions of the congregation giving over to them this kind of thinking in which they're now able to exercise the dictatorial rule over their congregation? You know, I've been in a number of Baptist churches in my life, and I can tell you that they're much more common than you think. In fact, I was just reading a fascinating article just this week that popped up about a very large megachurch just outside of Chicago, in which the elders are deeply divided over the fact that their pastor is a man with a dictatorial hand. And if I gave you his name, you would know him. The fact is that this is so easy for us. I can tell you how easy it is that when you place me on a pedestal that I think now I'm more important than I ought to be. It's easy to get puffed up in this position. Or how about those churches where the real grievances against the sinfulness of the pastor are swept under the rug because of his position in the church? How many times have we read in recent months of churches who've been discovered that they've had something that the pastor has been doing or someone else on the staff has been doing, but it's been quietly hidden away, swept under the rug, and now it's coming to light because somebody has come forward to speak. I mean, here's the reality, right? Elders are men. Elders are men. especially those that have been put in positions of teaching and responsibility, such as this one. And they're easily susceptible to their own ego. Believe me, I know this. I know this. They're susceptible to their own ego. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. So what Paul says here is, listen, if you're going to pick men out of your congregation, they must be mature in the faith. They cannot be recent converts, because someone who's been a recent convert, fresh converts to the faith, or fresh converts to the doctrine of grace, are more susceptible to the kinds of ego issues that Paul envisions here. You get somebody who's just encountered the doctrines of grace for the first time, and they're going to go out and they're going to say and do some things that are stupid. Because, hey, I've come to understand this now. You people should understand what I understand. I'll never forget it when I first came to faith in Christ at the age of 20. The next weekend I went home to my Catholic parents, and I said some things about the current Pope that turned off my ability to preach the gospel to them for 2 decades. I said stupid, foolish things. I was immature, young, dumb. That's what Paul is envisioning here. There's this idealism that comes out of young men, especially those that are coming out of seminary. They've got their books under their arm which teach them how to manage churches, right? And they've got this load of sermons that they want to preach, and they're going to come to the church and they're going to make changes, and they're going to come in, and their beliefs and their ideas are better than yours, and they've got great ideas. They can mold the church. And guess what they eventually succumb to? Either to their own ego or to the frustrations of dealing with people. Paul says these men must be men who have grown sufficiently in the application of the gospel to their own life, so that they recognize the natural temptations to self-aggrandizement that come with the office and how to avoid them. Don't call elders who are young because they haven't had enough time to put the gospel into their own lives in such a way that they recognize the need for humility in the face of the frustrations. I think, by the way, this is the biggest reason why Paul insists on a plurality of elders in the church. The church with a single pastor has set themselves up for failure in exactly this way. And then the second trap he must avoid is in verse 7. He says he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Notice the word fall being used in both verse 6 and verse 7. In this case here, he must avoid the snare of disgrace before outsiders. Now, Paul comes full circle here. Have you noticed it? The full circle is he starts at the beginning by saying he must be a man above reproach, and then he ends it by saying he must be a man of good reputation. To, in this case, outsiders. Outsiders. Now, there's a slight difference here where Paul goes here, so follow the logic. In this case, Paul probably is talking in regards to his own the actions of an elder, his own actions inside the church, as they are judged by those outside of the church. Okay, he must be above reproach inside the church. All the people of the church must recognize that he is a man who is given to spiritual maturity. But now Paul says he must also act inside the church in such a way that people outside the church see it and recognize that what he's doing is right and good. Verse 2 is probably more of the elder's reputation in the community. Here, it says an extension of the thought of verse 6, a man whose reputation within the church is seen by good even by those who are not part of the church. In other words, when they look at what he does inside the church as an outsider, they go, hey, that guy's doing a good thing in that place. In other words, a man who does his pastoral duties within the church such that even outsiders see him as being a good man. He leads his church well. He's not a dictator, and there is nothing for which he can be accused in the public sphere. Now, the thought here is an extension, as I said, of verse 6. Paul speaks here of a snare, the temptations proffered by the devil, and the obvious one is of self-aggrandizement. Again, of thinking of himself more highly than he ought, thinking that being an elder is so important that others must treat him with undue levels of respect, that he must have a sense in which everybody treats him as someone more important. You know, there used to be a day when the office of the pastor was considered by outsiders to be a high position in the community. Some of you are old enough to remember those days when, as a pastor, people would go, hey, he's a pastor. He's someone important. Not anymore. I can assure you that pastors are below taxi drivers on the list of reputable jobs. And taxi drivers are way down the list, by the way. The snare here is the idea that a man who's working inside the church thinks of himself so highly that he assumes even outsiders see him in that way. And that's the snare. He must be well thought of by outsiders. He must do his work not to advance himself, but to advance the cause of Christ. So I think where Paul is going after here is that sometimes it is easy to think, well, I'm a pastor, therefore my job is to do this work and be thought of well by people in the community. I'll do my job as an elder. People will see me as someone important in the community because, after all, I'm an elder of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, so that automatically gives me some sort of authority in the community. The problem with that is it becomes a temptation then to assume that your job as an elder inside the church is to do a work so that you're making yourself look better in the community rather than doing the work to advance the cause of Christ. Which means you might actually, in doing the work of this mission, do the wrong mission. Are we to be thought of well by people in the community? Yes, in a sense that our method may be good and unobnoxious, is that a word, to people, but not at the expense of the mission. Not at the expense of the mission. Let me put it in different terms. Let's assume for a moment that I really want to look good in the community because there's certain community positions that I really want to get my hands on, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my job as an elder in such a way that the people out there in the community will embrace me into those positions. That's okay as long as I have not sacrificed the mission of the gospel itself. It's easy then to go out and to be this or that in the community, but never preach the gospel to the people I go out and participate with. In other words, lose the mission in favor of the method. So I look great to the outsider, but not at the expense of the mission. I think that's where Paul is going here. The snare that he says here, the snare of disgrace, is the snare of the devil coming along with his subtleness and saying, Pastor, it's okay for you to go out in the community and be well thought of by people in the community. That's a good thing. You should want to do that. Oh, and by the way, if you preach the gospel, they're not going to like you so much. So you might want to tone it down a little bit in order that the people that you're working with will embrace you in the community. That's a snare. So the snare is, don't do your work in the church in such a way that outsiders see you as good and, hey, let's embrace this guy because he's smart, and then lose track of the mission that you're supposed to be on in the first place. Now, I know Paul doesn't say that directly, but it's kind of hard to miss, given the fact that what is he doing? He's talking here about the general reality of what it means to be an elder and what it means to hold fast the orthodoxy of the church itself. If the orthodoxy of the church is such that it loses track of the gospel, it's lost its orthodoxy. So we must not, as elders, we must not fall into these snares. An elder must be a man who works in such a way for the cause of Christ that even those outside of the church, the pagans outside of the church, appreciate what he does and how he does it without losing track of the mission itself. In other words, carry the balance. It's one thing to go out into the world and every time you go someplace to carry a Bible and hit people with it. You're not going to be well thought of by others in that case. But you can swing the pendulum too far in the other direction too, which is to never go out with your Bible and to always act as though you're everybody's best friend. The problem is you have to balance those two things. How do I be understood by the world as being a good man doing the work that I'm doing without sacrificing the mission at the same time? And I can assure you that's not easy. So, 7 verses Paul puts before us of what it means to be an elder. And I think if I step back from these verses, I think the idea that Paul wishes to express here is something more than just the idea of certain do's and don'ts that an elder should have. In fact, I was having a conversation with someone about this on Wednesday night. It's really not a matter of Paul saying these are the qualifications of what it means to be an elder, and so the other elders should just take out a checklist and go check, 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 okay, this guy's qualified. No, this is more of a matter of the first statement coming to play, where Paul says the man who desires this office desires a noble task. In other words, this is a man who says, if I'm going to take on the role of an elder, or other elders are going to be pursuing a man to take on the role, the primary issue isn't whether or not he can cross the T's and dot the I's, but whether this is a man who really understands what this office is all about. Does he really get the bigger picture of what it means to be raised to the level of being someone who's concerned about the spiritual lives of his people as his primary task, is willing to sacrifice whatever it takes to raise his people up? Does he really get that? Does he really get that? See, I think that should really be the primary question being asked as the very last question out of a seminary. The very last question that the seminary should be asking the man as he finishes his final exams, he's got all of his paperwork, he's got all of his training, the very last thing that the seminary ought to do, and the very first thing that the church ought to be doing, is asking this man, do you really understand what you're getting into? Do you really understand what you're taking on here? Do you really understand the nobility of this task? Do you really understand what God is calling you to do? You may be a gifted speaker. You may be an extraordinary administrator. You may have an ability to do all kinds of things, and you've been trained at all kinds of things. But do you really understand the gravity of this job? Does your home life show that you understand the gravity of the church as a family? Does your level of expectation as you put into people and how you relate to them in terms of patience versus frustration, do you really understand what this is going to take to walk into this position? Do you really get it? Or do you have these pie-in-the-sky ideas of what it means to be a person in power who can exercise his gifts of teaching and everyone will genuflect when you walk down the hallway? Paul says this is what it's about. It's about put men in place who understand this nobility. And as I said at the beginning of this series, that's your job as a congregation. In other words, what you should be saying is, we do not want men leading us who do not understand the nobility of this office. We demand from our current elders that any men that they bring forward to this task are men who get that, who have been through the sausage grinder of experience to understand what it means to deal with human beings. They understand patience. Their family lives demonstrate the sense in which they truly get it. You see, this isn't just preaching to elders. The 5 of us in this room who are currently elders, sure, this is a good buffer for us, a good reminder to us, right? We get buffed up again, so now we know what it is. But that's not really what Paul is doing. Paul's writing to a church and saying, this is what your expectation should be. Demand nothing less. Demand nothing less than that. Do not elevate the elders to some position of being so important that you lose track of what they're supposed to really be. See? That's where Paul's going here. That's what he really wants the church to understand. And I'm convinced that if a church understands the nobility of the office and puts those men in place that God has called out and gifted to that, then the church will find its boundaries. And they will be held fast by the Spirit through those men. Demand nothing less. Demand nothing less.